What is up, guys? Dan here, and I am finally back after a very long and somewhat unplanned break from making videos and from YouTube. I'm not going to go exactly why I had that long break, but anyway, I'm back, and today I am coming with, today I am coming to you with a highly requested video. And this is not just any video. This is a very special video because, as you guys who have been watching my videos for a while would know, my goal for the year was to hit 1,000 subscribers. And thanks to all of you guys, we managed to do that about a month ago. I think we're at a bit under 1,100 now. So thank you very much for subscribing. And so today I am coming to you guys with a highly requested video, which is a guide on starting in the laser. So before we get started going into the footage that I've compiled today, and there's a lot of it, we're going to look at more videos than we have in any other video that I've made in the past. Let's talk briefly about what our goals are for the start of the race. So it's kind of easy to look at the start as, you know, this big thing that you need to conquer in order to do well in a race. And that's fair, but it's also not quite accurate. So ultimately, the start of the race is just a means to an end. And really, we start the race or want to start a race such that we'll be able to execute our plan for the first leg, which should have the goal of getting us to the top mark in a good position. And so in order to do that, a lot of the time or nearly all of the time, our second goal for the start is that we are going to want to hit the line on the gun, on the start gun, with speed and clear air. And that's usually going to mean being in the first row of the fleet. And in order to tick off these two goals, there's going to be a few key points that we need to execute on, and these are going to be the focus for this video. So in this video, I'm not going to talk about which end of the start line you should pick. I'm not going to talk about strategy for first upwinds or anything like that. This is basically just going to be a video on doing these three things, which are lining up for the start and the timing of doing that, and also the timing of when you should pull the trigger, creating space on the line so that you have a good gap to accelerate into, and finally pulling the trigger, which is going to help you hit that line on the gun with speed. And so, as I mentioned, this video is going to take kind of a more micro view on starting, basically just looking at the boat handling and sort of mechanics of the start itself. But if you're looking for a video which talks more about how to pick an end of the start line or how to pick which side of the course you want to go to on the first leg, what I've done is I haven't made a video, but I've actually made a playbook full of the pre-start checks that I do before every race to help me decide what my strategy is going to be on the first leg and where I want to start on the start line. And if you want to get your hands on that playbook, I'm going to drop a link in the description. Just hit the link, fill out your email address, and you'll get that playbook sent to you. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Before we get into the main points of the video, I should mention this is probably going to be quite a long video. As I said earlier, I've gone through basically every single laser and ILCA medal race that exists on YouTube to find the perfect clips for this that are going to explain all the parts of the start that we want to cover in this video. So I think I've got something like 5 or 6 different medal race videos that we're going to go through. So sit back, enjoy, and let's get on to lining up and timing. So the first aspect of starting that we're going to talk about today is timing. And that relates to both when you line up for the start and also the timing to pull the trigger and accelerate for the start of the race. And the first thing to note is that this is going to be largely dependent on the wind strength and how favored one side of the start line is. So as we're going to see in some of our examples, when the wind is lighter, you can generally line up earlier for the start because the wind isn't going to be pushing you down the start line as much and you'll be able to hold your position better. And when it's a bit windier, that approach to the start line is probably going to come a little bit later. And of course, throughout the whole process of lining up for the start, whether that's lining up at 2 minutes to go or 1 minute to go or anywhere between that sort of time between 2 minutes and the gun, you're going to need to monitor your transits throughout this whole process. And in the pre-start check playbook that I talked about a little bit earlier, I talk about a time on distance test that I use before any race to try and gauge how long a certain distance is going to take to cover for that wind strength. So you're going to need to monitor your transits and have an idea in your head about how much time you have to burn until you're on the start line. And similar to what I've already talked about, when the wind is lighter, that generally means you're going to need more time to accelerate and get up to full speed compared to when it's windier. And this plays a pretty important part for your trigger pull. Of course, when you pull the trigger is going to depend on how close you are to the start line. But in general, when it's lighter, you might see people starting to wind up and accelerate at 10 seconds to go or 8 seconds to go. But when it's a bit windier, it might be less time, so 6 seconds or 5 seconds, just because you do accelerate quicker when it's windier. The first clip we're going to be watching comes from the Laser Radial Medal Race in Miami in 2018, where we can see that it is pretty windy. And you see now, no one's really lined up yet. People are still sort of cruising around. A lot of people still on port. And now you see here, there's 1 minute 25 to go till the gun. You see Norway and Sweden there still just sort of cruising around a bit. And as you can tell, and like I was talking about on the slideshow, it's windier here. So these girls are kind of delaying lining up for the start because in these windier conditions, the more time you spend sitting still, basically, the more you're going to drift down the start line. So you kind of want to leave it a little bit later so that you can hit the area of the line that you want and not worry about drifting around so much whilst you're sitting still before the start. Now, I want to contrast the last clip we saw to this one, which is the Laser Radial Medal Race from Miami again, but this time in 2019. Where the wind is a lot lighter than what we saw in the last clip. And so you see here on the countdown timer, there's about 2 minutes to go. But we're already starting to see a number of boats lining up towards the race committee end. And this is an important point. So if one side of the line is significantly favored, then you're also going to need to line up earlier and spend more time fighting for that position because basically everyone's going to try and be there and you want to claim your spot on the line earlier. And sort of similar to what I was talking about earlier in terms of wind strength, when the wind is lighter, you can also afford to line up earlier because you're not going to drift as much as when it's windy. And so you can see here now at 1:30, 1:40, basically all the girls are already lined up and fighting for that race committee end. Whereas compared to the windier medal race where it was 1:20, 1:25, and people were still sort of cruising around waiting to find their spot, in this light wind race with a very favored committee boat end, everyone's lining up super early and trying to get that pole position starting near the race committee boat. And now moving on to the next step in the starting equation, which is going to be creating space on the start line. So on the same thread that I was talking about in the timing slide, where anytime you're sitting still on the start line, you're going to be slipping to leeward in some way or another. So the best way that we can counteract that is by keeping the boat moving in some direction as often as possible. And what we're going to see in some of the techniques that top sailors use to create space is they're not just moving forward all the time, they're also reversing and sailing backwards a lot of the time as well. And that's going to help them stay in the spot that they want. And also they use that tool to be able to create more space for them after they've reversed, and then can use forward momentum to shoot back up into the wind. So with the little diagram here, that's the basic concept. If you've got forward momentum, then you're going to have less leeway and less slip to leeward, which will help you hold your position better. And so, as I was saying, there's multiple techniques that top sailors use to create space on the start line. These include reversing out of their gap and then shooting back up in the wind and closer to the wind than they were before. Crabbing, which is very illegal, but I'm not here to make any judgments on the morality of it. It's simply a fact that all the top sailors are doing this. Double tacking, so tacking onto port, gaining some ground to your competitor to windward, and then tacking back onto starboard. And then finally shooting up into the wind, holding your boat head to wind for as long as possible, and also holding your competitor to windward into the wind as long as possible, and then bearing the boat away again and getting ready to accelerate. And so I'm going to go through examples of all of these and try and explain as well as I can exactly what the sailors are doing for each of these maneuvers to create space on the start line. So the first example that we're going to go through of how top sailors use sailing backwards to help gain more of a gap on the start line comes from the men's medal race from Marseille in 2018. And with these techniques, we're going to watch them all on a bit slower speed than normal speed, just so we can actually see exactly what's happening, because everything does tend to happen quite quickly with these maneuvers. And then once we've gone through them slowly, I'll replay it at full speed. So you see here, there's a number of boats lining up towards the race committee end. And so what I want you to pay attention to here is this second boat at the race committee end is a GBR sailor, and he's just had this sailor from Finland come in quite close to leeward of him. And so you see now this Finnish sailor is kind of taking his gap. And so what you see the British sailor doing, he's now sailing backwards out of that gap and then back up to windward. And so what that allows him to do is he comes back out to windward, and then he can pull on his vang, start sheeting back on, and then go further up into the wind than he was previously, giving him a heap more space from the Finnish sailor below. And so you see now, he's now much, much closer to the boat that was above him, and he's created that half boat length gap to the Finnish sailor. And so now that the Finnish sailor has seen him do this, he's also reversing out to try and get as close to the GBR sailor as possible. So you see Finland reversing out now and going back up to windward. And now he's sailing to try and close the gap to GBR so that he can... And see, it's sort of like a cat and mouse game. We just saw the GBR sailor go back out after Finland reversed his sail, and now they're going at it, trying to close the gap to the windward boat as much as possible and create as much space from the leeward boat as they can. And so there, this is Mickey Beckett, I think. You sort of see him now just trying to put Herman, who we saw the point of view shot from, into a tough position. So we'll go back now. So now we'll watch that again at full speed. So you see Finland, who I think is Kalle Tapper, getting pretty close there to Mickey Beckett. and Mickey then reverses out, shoots up to windward whilst reversing, and now he's going to start sailing forward again and create more space above Tapper and close the gap to the boat to windward. And then after he opens that gap over the Finnish sailor, you see Finland, who I think is Kalle Tapper, reverses out and then tries to close the gap again. And so this is a technique that is going to be used a lot amongst the top sailors, especially in winds which aren't too strong, so say up to 18 knots, where reversing is still pretty easy. But even in strong winds, these guys are really comfortable reversing. So they'll reverse out, go back up to windward, then pull on the vang, sheet on, and try and put the boat to windward of them in a tough position by shooting back up into the wind and opening that gap. So the next technique that I want to talk about is crabbing. As I mentioned, this is very illegal. I'm not going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't do it. That's up for you to decide for yourself. But the simple fact is that all of the top sailors are doing it to some extent. And as a jury trying to monitor a 40, 50, 60 boat start line, it's very, very difficult to actually spot someone doing this when they're amongst a fleet that big. So people who are doing it basically never get penalized for it. And as we'll see here, sailors are even willing to do it in a medal race with only 10 boats because it's very hard to get penalized for. And crabbing is basically when you shoot up into the wind, the sail will be either against your hand, you're holding it out, or also you can push it with your shoulder, and that backwinds the sail, and at the same time you scull a little bit to windward, and that basically pushes the boat into the wind whilst holding the same position, as in same position backwards and forwards to the start line. And you'll even see some sailors actually pull the centerboard up a little bit whilst doing this because that helps them slip to windward even more. So let's jump into an example of crabbing, and we can actually see two sailors doing it here. This comes from the Gamagori laser radial medal race in 2017. I'm going to play this clip in slow motion so that we can see exactly what's happening. We are on board with Emma Plasher, who is wearing the blue jersey going into the medal race. So you see here the Greek sailor. She has her tiller to windward. She's pulled the centerboard up and she's pushing the boom out with her shoulder whilst head to wind. And that's basically creating the effect of sliding the boat to windward without actually sailing backwards. And now obviously that's putting Emma in a pretty tough spot. So now Emma's going to do the same. You see she backwinds the sail here. Tiller goes over to windward. And that's helping create this space here that you can see. The gap opening up to Vasilia and the gap closing to Josephine Olsen from Sweden. And so you see here, these sailors very comfortable with having the boom rest on their shoulder because they know that's going to help them get closer to the competitor above them. So let's watch that in full speed now. So you see Vasilia has the centerboard all the way up and she's closing that gap to Emma. Emma now has to come into the wind, backwind the sail, put the tiller to windward, and that opens the gap back up again for her to Vasilia. And the next technique on the list that I want to talk about is double tacking. And a couple of important points with double tacking. You want to be very, very clear on the rule situation here. So you will be going on to port tack, which obviously means you have no rights. And you need to be very clear about when you are back on starboard tack and when you've completed your tack. Doing double tacks on the start line is going to require very good boat handling skills because you are going to need to use a lot of boat heel to initiate the tack quickly, and you're going to need to be able to control that in all sorts of wind strengths. So our example here is going to come from the 2021 European Continental Qualifier in Villamura. And the sailor I want to pay attention to is Stefano Peschiera from Peru. You see here that he's going to have, I believe it's Tonči Stepanovic from Croatia, come up and start closing the gap from leeward, and also the Irish sailor comes up and starts closing the gap. But you see that Stefano has this very big gap here to windward, above the Italian sailor and between himself and the other Croatian sailor. And so you see now he uses his heel, heels the boat back into the wind when he's on port to initiate the tack back onto starboard as quickly as possible. And depending on how much space you have to do a double tack, you might need to be more aggressive with heeling the boat. Both on starboard, you heel the boat into windward to pull it on top of you, jump over to the other side, sail a little bit towards the boat to windward, and then throw the boat back into the wind to initiate that tack again. And so you see now he's created a pretty nice gap here above the Irish sailor and is now putting both the Italian and the Croatian sailor in a pretty difficult position. So now we'll watch that at full speed again. You see the Irish sailor's coming now to steal his gap. And so Stefano sheets on, rolls straight into the tack, and then as soon as the Italian sailor on starboard gets in the way, he heels the boat into the wind and goes straight back into attack to get himself back onto starboard. And now he has a great gap to accelerate into for the start. And so the final technique that I want to talk about on this slide is shooting into the wind. And now this is actually something which is a part of the previous three techniques that I mentioned, but this is really, really critical because, you have to be able to master this skill to double tack or to crab or to reverse out and then reopen your gap. So shooting into the wind, you are usually going to start from an angle slightly below close hauled, and you will want to have a little bit of vang tension to increase the tension of the leech on the sail, which means you're not going to slip sideways as much, and it will give a bit more power to your rudder whilst you're sailing. So you're going to want to start sheeting on. You can't go straight into shooting into the wind. You are going to need a little bit of forward momentum first. And as you're sheeting on and developing that forward momentum, you can heel the boat to leeward to start turning up, and then let the rudder follow the heel to leeward so that you start coming into the wind. And then as soon as you head to wind, what you'll see a lot of sailors do is they release the vang a little bit, duck straight under the boom, and the boom's basically dead in the center of the boat, and you're just going to sit in that position as long as you can, holding the boat to windward of you out so that you can create a bigger gap below you. And then right before you start feeling your boat starting to slip backwards or you lose a bit of that momentum, you can bear away to a more of a close hold angle, sheet back, pull the vang back on a little bit and continue sailing slowly forward so you don't lose that gap that you've just created. So the example we're going to go through here comes from the men's medal race in Perth 2011. It isn't the most high quality footage, but it's probably the best that I could find in terms of explaining this technique. So let's watch it on slow motion to start off with. So you see, I think, Paul Goodison here, and you also see one of the sailors from New Zealand. So what you're seeing now, he sort of did what we saw earlier, which was reversing out a bit. And now he's got the boat down slightly. After he reverses out, he has the boat slightly below close hauled. He's still got a bit of tension in his vang. He starts sheeting on to develop that momentum that we talked about so that you can shoot into the wind, heeling the boat a little bit, and now he's into the wind, booms basically over the center of the boat, and he's just going to try and sit there for as long as possible, keeping Paul Goodison up, and then as soon as he starts to lose that forward momentum, he's going to scull hard with the rudder, bear away, and get back to more of a close hold course. And so you see now he's just initiating the sculling there as the camera angle changes. So we see Tom Slingsby doing the same thing here. You see he's sheeting on, using leeward heel to go up into the wind. Then he jumps straight under the boom to sail as far into the wind as possible. And then you see him now just starting to bear away again once he's made that gap. And so you see now this is Tom Slingsby here. He's got a pretty nice gap below him after that. So now we'll go back and watch that on normal speed. This is also a good example. You see that none of these guys are really lined up yet, and that's still with only 1 minute to go. So when it is windier, you can afford to line up a bit later for the start. And so here we go now. We see the New Zealand sailor backing out, and then he's going to sheet on, develop a bit of forward momentum, and then shoot up into the wind, create that gap, and try and put Paul Goodison under pressure. And now Tom Slingsby, you see he does have tension in the sail, starts sailing forward a bit, and then immediately goes straight up into the wind once he has the forward momentum to get him there. And so those are the main techniques that we're going to use on the start line to give us a gap to leeward, put the boat to windward under pressure, and then allow us, once we have that gap, to get a good acceleration to hit the line at the gun with speed. So the final thing, or final part of the start which we are going to talk about, and which kind of ties it all together, is pulling the trigger. As the first point says, the mechanics are going to be roughly the same for all wind strengths, but as it gets windier, you are going to put less emphasis on heeling the boat to leeward. And so before we jump into the videos, I'm just going to walk us through the steps of the trigger pull. So you'll probably be on the start line pretty close to head to wind. First step is to use the rudder to aggressively bear away. So you're going to bear away very hard to with the tiller going to windward, but the boat going to leeward. Once you're at or slightly below your close hold course, you are going to pull on the vang to the amount that you need for the first upwind and sailing upwind. Then you're going to start sheeting on. And at this point, if it's very light winds, you are going to start using a lot of leeward heel. If it's windier, you can probably just rely on the main sheet to start steering the boat up to the close hold course. And if you had been using some leeward heel, right as you get to your close hold course, you're going to jump onto the windward side of the boat, aggressively flatten, and that's going to accelerate the boat for the final sort of pump to get you up to full speed as you hit the line. And the other important thing to note about using a tiller to bear away is that this is where you can get penalized for sculling. And so the Rule 42 sort of definition of sculling is if the tiller crosses the center line of the boat. So if you're using the tiller, you can't have it go to windward and to leeward. You can only use it to steer one way. So you can aggressively push the tiller to windward to get the boat to bear away, or you can do the opposite. You can push it aggressively to leeward to get the boat to head up, but you can't have it going in both directions. And so with that said, let's jump into some of the examples that I found. So the first example is going to come from the Miami 2016 medal race. Let's just watch this on slow speed. So we're going to be watching Robert Scheidt here. Interesting to note about how Robert does this is that even though the wind is quite light, he does not use a lot of leeward heel to steer the boat and doesn't need to aggressively flatten as much, but he does go through all the steps that we just mentioned. So you can see now he's bearing away. He pulls on his vang, and now he's sheeting on. He heels the boat to leeward, and then as he gets the boat to where he wants it, he flattens it. And that's the gun there. So let's just watch that again in slow motion because it was happening quite quickly. So from here, you see he now starts bearing away, sheets on, heels the boat to leeward, and then when he's at close hold, he flattens and he's sailing. All right, we're going to watch that again at normal speed because it does happen quite quickly. And as we see, great start there from Robert Scheidt, as you would expect from the best. So this next example is going to come from the laser radial medal race from Aarhus in 2018, where it is a lot windier. And the sailor I want us to pay attention to is Paige Rayleigh, who is here to leeward. So you see now she's pretty much at or below a close hold course. You can see that she's already pulled her vang on and it's ready to go to sail upwind. I think the countdown time is probably a little bit out of sync with the actual start, but you'll see now she's bearing away, starts sheeting on now. Basically doesn't need to use any leeward heel to turn the boat, and then once she's at her close hold course, she flattens it and is at full speed. So let's watch that again. So sheeting on aggressively and now hitting close hold and flattening the boat hard. So one more time, we'll watch that at normal speed. So you can see when it's windier, she basically only started sheeting on at 5 seconds to go there. So, you know, she knows that she'll accelerate quickly, so she doesn't need to start sheeting on super early. All right, guys, that is it for this video. As you can see, I basically went through every single laser medal race there is on YouTube to try and find the best examples for each of the slides. I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to let me know down in the comments and also give me some ideas for future videos or anything else you want to see from me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.